If Forza Motorsport has 1 million fans, I am one of them. If Forza Motorsport has 10 fans, I am one of them. If Forza Motorsport has only 1 fan, that is me. If Forza Motorsport has no fans, then that means I am no longer on Earth. Basically, I kind of like this series. Like many, I found out about it because of having an Xbox 360 instead of a PS3 and it being the alternative to Gran Turismo on that platform, but it went on to mean a lot more to me than just that. Forza was what I was playing when my brain switched on and I realised I like racing in real life, so it became the first way I could interact with and understand the world of racing. Not to get too philosophical about it though, I also just think they're more interesting as games than a lot of people seem to give them credit for. And with the recent news of mass layoffs at Microsoft potentially spelling the end for Turn 10 and this series in general, I thought now was the time to pay tribute to a series that I've always felt, even in its lowest points, is a satisfying controller-friendly, sim-ish racing game. Just one thing to clear up before we get started, I'm not talking about Forza Horizon here. I love those games too, don't get me wrong, but those games are the opposite of underappreciated, and also don't appear to be in such jeopardy thanks to continuing success. The topic of this video is exclusively the Forza Motorsport series, 1 to 7 and the 2023 game. This also isn't supposed to be a full review of each of these games, but more just a view of how the series' identity exists and changes with each game, with a particular focus on the tracks included. I'm more of a racing guy than a car guy, so I don't really concern myself with numbers of cars or how realistically they're portrayed or anything. Also, nobody at me about anything weird I do in my gameplay footage. I only said that I like these games, not that I'm any good at them. The original Forza Motorsport came out for the original Xbox in May 2005. Quite a late title to release as an OG Xbox exclusive considering the 360 was out just 6 months later, but if it helps, it was supposed to come out in December 2004 before a series of delays. That doesn't actually help at all, does it? Those delays meant that Forza's inaugural offering would have to go up against Gran Turismo 4, which released first, even though Forza started development back in 2002, when the obvious game to use as a template would have been Gran Turismo 3. You have to admire the Forza marketing team for going all in on the simulation racing war with Gran Turismo 4, even though, if we're comparing these two games, it's pretty clear who comes out on top. 20 years removed from all this though, I think it's a fascinating study of what a new team does when given Gran Turismo 3 to work from. Like I said earlier, my special interest here is in the track selection of each game, and we'll get to that soon. But of course, as this is the first game in the series, here is where we see some fundamentals first established for how Forza works, both as a game in its own right, and in terms of a comparison to Gran Turismo. Despite everything, these two aren't actually that similar in terms of how they play. To the layman, both are realistic driving games, but the difference is that Gran Turismo has always gone more on the realism end of things, while Forza from the very beginning has been a little more forgiving. I've never raced in real life, so I wouldn't like to say how realistic either game truly is, but there's a certain bounciness to Forza's driving model, a snappiness in the handling that makes it clear this is a console game for playing with a controller. Gran Turismo plays perfectly well on the controller too, of course, but it demands a lot more precision and truly comes alive with a wheel in a way that Forza never really has. That forgivingness carries over to the overall structure of the game as well. Forza is quite infamous, whether in Motorsport or Horizon flavour, for showering you with new cars on a pretty basic level up system, which makes the career mode about hopping between different cars for loosely themed events, rather than Gran Turismo's classic rags to riches format. I personally think that's absolutely fine. The Gran Turismo structure is great for giving personality to your little shitboxes that you start the game with, and making the race cars feel like the top of a mountain you're aiming for, but I've always felt Forza does it well too. You could get an A or S class car at any time, so when you do, they end up just feeling like part of your garage, alongside the C and D class cars you'll sometimes still need as the game progresses. On the note of those classes, this was something that was clearly a good enough idea that Gran Turismo later started doing the same thing, condensing your car's performance into a number you can compare to others and get a rough idea of how it will perform in a race. However, I will admit the Forza system doesn't really incentivize knowing what each upgrade really does, especially in later games when they just really streamlined it by letting you tell the game to decide for you. Lastly, let's just say what we all know to be true. Gran Turismo has the source in a way that Forza simply doesn't. If Forza was Xbox's answer to Gran Turismo 3, the way it presents itself couldn't look more mid-2000s Microsoft if it tried. Gran Turismo 3 is my favourite game in its series in terms of presentation, with the bold orange and black text and next-gen graphics, some of the funkiest OST of any game, and just a confident style overall. One of the things it seems pretty clear was a priority for Forza from the word go was real-world tracks. This was clearly not a revolution. Racetracks have been recreated in virtual form ever since pole position, but taking Gran Turismo 3 as a starting point, this was an area it made sense to expand on. Gran Turismo 3 has only two real-world tracks, Laguna Seca and an unlicensed version of the Monaco Grand Prix circuit, and Forza expands that to a selection of six. Laguna Seca is here as well, but we also have Road Atlanta, Road America, Tsukuba, Silverstone, and the Nürburgring Nordschleife. This was around the time that every game started putting the Nordschleife in to prove how big and detailed their locations could be, although interestingly Forza also offers the option to race it as a series of point-to-point races instead, and more on those in a bit. Aside from that, which is basically just there as a flex, the other real-world tracks are also iconic venues for all sorts of motor racing. I assume it must be tough to get licenses for an unproven racing game, so I don't know how much of this was down to choice compared to whatever they could get, but it is a good selection. Laguna Seca is always a thrill ride. The all-encompassing nature of the corkscrew means that how you build up and exit it is just as important as the turn itself. Tsukuba is great fun for races in slower cars, and an exhilarating time trial in faster ones. Road Atlanta is a great pull for recognizing American sports car racing. These games are how I learned about the track in the first place, and it became one of my favourites, with the technical first sector giving way into a full throttle slingshot at the end of the lap. Road America has one of my favourite course sections of any, going as fast as you can through turn 8 to set up the long carousel, then blast through the kink and try to survive through Canada Corner. And Silverstone has been a legendary circuit for decades, although as a big fan of Bridge Corner, I'm always particularly pleased to play a game released before the renovations. Silverstone and Road Atlanta also offer short layout variations here, and that sort of variety is something I always like to see as well. It's the original tracks that make a racing game truly iconic though. Even here it feels like Turn 10 were looking towards real tracks for some of their offerings, making fictional versions of some real circuits that couldn't make it in their proper forms. Blue Mountains Raceway is a tight, twisty run up a mountain road with blind corners all around that falls away into a long straight, and a chicane that begs you to try and take it as fast as possible. Basically, it's Mount Panorama with the branding scraped off. You can race this one in reverse, which is not realistic, and I kind of think the layout could do without at least one of these hairpins, but apart from that, it's a decent alternative to the real thing. Sunset Peninsula is their nod to American oval racing, with quite a shallow tri-oval for its speedway configuration, and an infield course that feels a little bit like the Indianapolis road course, in the sense that it runs clockwise and runs up the banking for its final corner. But if there's one track that screams Forza to most people, it's probably Maple Valley Raceway. I've always felt that this was Forza's equivalent to Autumn Ring from Gran Turismo, the autumnal vibe obviously being the main comparison, but also in that it has a short layout that's one of the first tracks you'll play in the career mode, and an expanded version characterised by wild elevation and camber changes, plus a crossover in the layout. There's at least 3 sections on Maple Valley that I love for being truly daredevil moments. How much speed do you bring into these sweeping hairpins or the downhill rush to the final chicane to keep on the limit? Alpine Ring makes its only appearance in this first game as a fairly nondescript mountainous track, but quite a fun one. Elevation changes, wide multi-line corners, and an undulating final sector with blind corners you can take flat if you've got the guts for it, all smacks a bit of circuits like Spa or the Red Bull Ring, with an anachronistic dollop of Gran Turismo's Dragon Trail for comparison's sake. Forza's city tracks also seem directly inspired from the implementation of a similar idea in Gran Turismo. Tokyo Circuit is perhaps the most on-the-nose comparison, as Gran Turismo have been doing tracks on Tokyo roads since the very beginning, and parts of Forza's version seem to be lifted right out of Special Stage Route 5 or Route 246. Racing on this track is interesting given how tight and narrow the middle part is, but I love the final little complex of corners here. It's almost a Tabak swimming pool situation with these chicanes, and it's easy to get caught out by the drop once you start the next lap. New York Circuit is another funny situation, as seemingly by coincidence, Gran Turismo 4 would also introduce one of its own, taking place around roughly the exact same spot in Manhattan. Forza offers a short layout for a high-speed blast down Times Square and around Columbus Circle, but also a longer course taking you up and down and all around. Rio de Janeiro is the third city track, and it's kind of a weird one. I don't really know what about it is supposed to read as Rio. It's kind of just a fast, long street circuit with a couple of tunnels and some insane chicanes to blast through. It is a pretty fun track though, but let's put a pin in this for now. The last circuit I wanted to mention for Forza 1 is the test track, and this only proves my point that this was using Gran Turismo 3 as a base. That game had, almost as an Easter egg, the complex string track. Parts of this track were used in the license tests, so they decided to just play connect the dots with it to give a long track with various handling challenges to test all at once. Forza doesn't have license tests, but they copied the idea anyway, and put it into the game like any normal track. So you can do these tight hairpins or square slalom challenges in a race with 7 AI opponents. The same goes for the test track's oval, which is almost identical to the one in Gran Turismo 3 by being comically large and simply an endurance test for your throttle finger. Lastly, it's time to talk about Forza's point-to-point options. Gran Turismo by this point was committed to what is actually a pretty perfunctory rally mode, and given the motorsport of the situation here, you might have expected them to pull something similar for the side mode. Instead, 2 unique environments are on offer for races not taking place on circuits, which is neat. Pacific Shipyards is one of the strangest Forza tracks ever. Not only was it completely removed from the series after its appearance here, but the way it's designed feels like it was lifted from a different type of game altogether. Leaving the paved road to go weaving around a dockyard with chain link fences and parked trucks to avoid sounds more like Need for Speed than anything else. But I have to wonder if this wasn't some sort of inspiration for Forza Horizon later down the line. As mentioned earlier, you can do point-to-point races on a quarter of the Nürburgring at a time if you want, and unsurprisingly there's a drag strip too, but the main attraction in this part of the game is the legendary Fujimi Kaido. This Toge course quickly became a fan favourite, and it's easy to see why. The cartoonishly steep elevation changes, banked hairpin turns on the mountain pass, tunnels that obscure your view, it all makes for a great challenge in a time trial or race situation. You can race either half the track or the full run in both downhill and hill climb directions, and I've always been partial to the downhill run myself. I find it more exciting to try and control the speed when the momentum wants you to go even faster. I love the part at the bottom of the mountain where the road opens up for a flat-out blast to the finish. Forza's greatest generation began with Forza Motorsport 2 in 2007. This was really the first game in the series to attract a big audience. Not that Forza 1 had done badly, but with the Xbox 360 leading practically by default at this point in the generation, and Gran Turismo 5 feeling almost like vaporware on the PS3 side, Forza had the chance to become a proper household name with this entry. It's not like I know the entire development history of this game or anything, and again, that's not really what I'm trying to focus on here, but it wouldn't surprise me if Turn 10 knew they had to strike while the iron was hot, because a good amount of the vibe of Forza 2 is essentially Forza HD. The way the menus and career mode are structured is essentially the same as the first game, and while the UI doesn't look exactly the same, it does feel like a coat of paint over what they had before. Something about the handled Gothic typeface combined with the total basic system font for other UI elements just screams slightly rushed but needs to fit the Blade's dashboard in a really charming way. Anyway, let's get to the tracks. The balance this time around has shifted even more in favour of real-life circuits. Not only does this game not introduce any new fictional tracks, it actually removes a bunch from the first game. Alpine Ring, Blue Mountain, Tokyo, and Rio, as well as every point to point race, are all gone. Even of what remains, New York Circuit is now missing its longer variant and now exists only as the hourglass shaped straight line speed test. The one exception is that the test track complex has been expanded. Now renamed the Sidewinder Proving Grounds, its presence as a copy in spirit of Gran Turismo 3's complex string is only funnier with time, but there are now 8 new layout options to combine different sections of the track together in various ways. I don't mind this, although it is a bit weird that the whole division of the career mode is focused on races taking place in this one locale. Maple Valley is starting to look a little bit Xbox 360 brown, but the HD finish is still nice, and Sunset Peninsula remains the lone holdout of American-style ovals. The speedway itself is called Nissan Speedway now, but the infield track has no sponsor and it's still the same track, so I don't really know what the story is there. It's also worth mentioning you now have the option to race a reversed version of every fictional track. Forza 1 only offered that for some tracks, so that's a nice improvement. So, if it's all about the real tracks this time around, what have we got? Laguna Seca, Road Atlanta, and the Nürburgring are the tracks on offer with no changes from the first game. I'm still not sure why they think the Nordschleife start line is in the long straight though. Silverstone and Tsukuba return as well, but with some additional layout options, which I always like to see. If Tsukuba wasn't short enough for you already, give the short version a try, which cuts the back straight in half. Silverstone keeps the Grand Prix and National layouts, but also now offers the curious International layout. This variant of the pre-2010 circuit takes you what would now be the wrong way down the farm curve before a hairpin at Abbey. 3 more real circuits complete the roster for Forza 2. Suzuka is renowned as a driver's circuit, and it makes sense to have it in as many racing games as they can get it. My favourite section has always been the Degners and into the hairpin, flicking the car into the complex and trying to keep as much speed under the bridge to go for an overtake or carry momentum for a timed lap is a real thrill. You can also choose to race the East Circuit for a test of your skills on the S's, or the seldom seen West Circuit, which turns a legendary 130R into the first corner before a fairly clumsy double right-hander spits you out on the exit of Dunlop. Sebring is another jewel in the crown for American endurance racing, pairing nicely with the ALMS cars that make up a big part of the R-class cars in this game, although it's not a circuit I've ever particularly got on with. My skill issue, of course, and I have always had a soft spot for the final corner and the multitude of possible lines through it. There's 3 different layouts to race on: the full course, the short course, which cuts off the middle section, or the club circuit that takes place entirely on the middle section. Lastly, Mugello is a true classic. Maybe it's more of a motorcycle track historically, but it's proof if proof were needed that elevation changes are the key to a great racing circuit. The corners are relatively simple and joined together by a few straights, but no 2 corners are the same, and it turns every lap into an adventure. Keen-eyed viewers may have noticed that one real track from Forza 1 hasn't made the cut: Road America. Now you see, Forza Motorsport had always been a series closely tied to Xbox Live. The first game had the option to play your career mode against human opponents, although I don't really know how that worked and it's 15 years too late to find out, and the second game expands on that functionality by adding everyone's favourite paid DLC. There were 5 DLC car packs and 2 more that added new tracks. I'm going on this whole tangent because A, the Xbox 360 store is shut down, B, Forza Motorsport 2's DLC was delisted back in 2008, C, I didn't even have an Xbox until 2009, and D, the complete collection disc with all the DLC on it is NTSC exclusive, so basically I can't play the DLC tracks. One of them was the comeback of Road America, and the other one was Twin Ring Motegi, another newcomer of a real-life circuit, with the oval speedway available to race alongside 3 different layouts of the road course, but we'll talk more about that later. With those additions, that leaves Forza 2's track offerings with one less unique environment compared to the first game, but around 20 more track configurations and layouts. And so my time with the Xbox 360 comes full circle with Forza Motorsport 3, released in 2009 as, quite famously I'm sure, the first game I got with my console. Well, this and Lip's #1 hits. Now there's a dead Xbox franchise for you. In some ways, this game is the series' first big reinvention, and in another, it's simply the definitive experience of everything so far. The presentation style changed massively here, from Forza 1's vaguely skeuomorphic designs and Forza 2's grungy carbon fiber vibe to an almost mirror's edge style of bold colours and sharp edges on a white background. The logo for this game, which was supposed to represent an F, M, and 3, ended up becoming the basic FM logo used for the rest of the series, including the Horizon games. This was the game that introduced Forza's infamous rewind feature, allowing you to simply undo a mistake, and in this game, you can't turn it off. The career mode structure is completely different as well, with the simple event lists from before giving way to a season calendar, where you pick the events you'll race in over a 10-year career. This works really well with what I was saying earlier about the different car classes allowing every car in your garage to have its time to shine. See here in my 16-year-old save that I was doing a World Championship in R2 class race cars, while also running weekday events for F-class shitboxes on oval speedways. With my memories of this game being what they were, and the stark difference in the presentation and feel of this game compared to the first two, I had an assumption that this would be the series trying to move away from its perceived as awkward predecessors, but in fact there's just as much celebration of what came before, and the tracks are a perfect way to show it. Every track from Forza Motorsport 2 was carried over into 3. All the fictional tracks and their reverse layouts, all the real circuits and whatever layout variants they had previously, and even Sidewinder Proving Grounds are still present and accounted for, albeit with the layouts now just named layout A to I instead of the snake motif, which is a bit of a shame. Technically the Proving Grounds were DLC, but it was day 1 DLC that all new copies of the game had a download code to redeem, and it's something of a moot point anyway because the Ultimate Collection has everything on disc and released worldwide this time. Tracks that had been DLC in Forza 2 are now in the base game for 3, so Road America is back, and we can now talk about Motegi in full. I really like this track, not only because it's cool to see a proper oval outside America, but because the road course doesn't limit itself to the oval's infield. I love the sweeping corners after you leave the oval's boundaries, and the long back straight into a downhill braking zone. You can have some really fun races here. The East and West circuits split the complex up a bit, and as the East circuits has the parts I just mentioned, I prefer that one. As for the other returning circuits, I won't spend too much time treading old ground, but Forza 3 is a lot brighter and more colourful in its environments than 2, which is a big benefit to Maple Valley in particular. Sunset Peninsula has lost its Nissan sponsorship for the oval, while New York has some additions. The circuit as it was in Forza 2 is now known as the Old Circuit, with the now known as the main layout being pretty much the same, but throwing some tyre chicanes in to break up the straights. The new version is obviously a bit more interesting to drive, but I don't think it makes for better racing. These chicanes aren't really overtaking opportunities, and they're relatively single file. There is, of course, plenty new here as well. I briefly mentioned earlier that this game's career features a recurring series of World Championship events, and in that spirit, the new real-world circuits are ones that come right from the upper echelons of motorsport. The base game featured the Circuit de Catalunya, a mainstay on the F1 calendar, at the time at least, with the Grand Prix circuit featuring alongside the abridged National Circuit and the tiny School Circuit, localised entirely within the first sector. While it's perhaps not the most exciting racetrack in the world, it is a good example of a multi-disciplined one. Corners at every speed, long straights, some elevation and camber changes, and enough pedigree for some strong opinions to be fostered about its layout over the years. I'm mainly talking about the infamous chicane at the final corner, but I was a bit caught out by the National Circuit using the pre-1995 Nissan corner. It seems like a few video game representations of this track do this, but I can't actually find any evidence of it ever being used like that in real life. The other new real track is none other than the Circuit de la Sarthe, host of the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Now, admittedly, Gran Turismo beat into the punch on this one, but this was the start of a long association between Forza and Le Mans. There was a Forza sponsor banner at Tertre Rouge for a long time that I certainly always noticed. As you tend to see when Le Mans gets a virtual representation, the then current version of the track is accompanied by a version that removes the chicane from the Mulsanne Straight, for your almost but not quite retro vibes. As you don't always see, Forza also lets you race the Bugatti circuit. Not quite as loved as its big brother, but an important part of the complex nonetheless. A DLC pack, or the Ultimate Collection disc, adds a third real-world track, finally extending the Nürburgring to include the Grand Prix circuit. Unfortunately, the game treats these two as different locations, so we'll still have to wait for the combined layout, but the full and short versions of the Grand Prix circuit are still welcome additions. The arena section has always confounded me about how best to take it, but I do really like the back section. From the hairpin through the Michael Schumacher S, which for some reason is missing a dedication in this version, and the fast kink in a sea of grass. Forza 3's other key identity, aside from world-class racetracks, is combined locations. The headline new tracks in this game really feel like testing grounds for the open-world concept that would soon be seen in Forza Horizon. The Amalfi Coast Circuit, a tight zip around the narrow streets of a quaint Italian village, is, we'll say, inspired by the Costa di Amalfi and Città d'Aria tracks from Gran Turismo 4, but the small circuit makes up just a part of the huge Rally di Positano location. The roads here form one big intertwined loop if you want to go on a tour of the whole place, but Forza 3 reintroduces point-to-point racing as well, with Positano split into 4 sections in both directions. The return of point-to-point racing means Fujimi Kaido is also a returning track, having skipped the second game to reappear here, and this is where the legend was truly born. The path is as exaggerated as ever, but it somehow feels like a real mountain road, with posted speed limits, warning signs, roadside shrines, and the next-gen graphics bump that allows for breathtaking views from the top of the mountain and the insane tease of a village at the bottom. If you ever wanted to know why people have been clamouring for a Horizon game set in Japan for the series' entire run, I think this is your answer. While there isn't another track location set here, fleshing out the world by putting this here is a tantalising look at a combined world in a game like this. Oh, and on top of all that, they made another half a track again so that you can do a full circuit run up one side of the mountain and down the other. The new side of the track, as it's called, is a bit less twisty than the old, with a vibe that feels more like a road following the side of the mountain rather than carving a path straight through it. It makes a full run feel nice and varied though, and if you run the old course for the climb, you can get some dizzying speed on the downhill sections in the new course. But I digress. The headline new set of locations for Forza 3 are a trilogy of circuits in the vicinity of Montserrat in Catalonia. The Ladera test track kind of reminds me of the Paul Ricard circuit, with its brightly coloured lines on the outside, and a layout that's perhaps better for hot laps than racing, although I do quite like this long corner into a chicane and difficult braking zone, which appears on all 3 versions of the track, so I get my fun whatever I'm doing. The Iberian International Circuit is a bit of a strange one, where I feel like the smaller layouts are more interesting. Weaving between the rocks in the infield section is a better use of the space than the relatively arbitrary feeling full circuit, although sometimes you do need a high-speed perimeter run as well. The final piece of the puzzle is the Camino Viejo de Montserrat. This small system of public roads that makes up most of the track allows for perhaps the most stunning environment in this series so far, as the mountainside view opens up from around the first corner for an undulating run along the cliffside and up to the dam. There's a reason this track serves as the prologue to the career mode. They knew it was special. The thing that really ties it together though is the Extreme circuit. Unlike other layout variants on other tracks, this is at the end of the list on its own after all the reverse variants, and it's one big lap that takes you around the Camino Viejo, Iberian circuit, and Ladera test track all in one go. Again, this display of a combined world with fictional roads on real locations really feels like testing the waters for some of the routes you can take in the Forza Horizon series, and it's cool to see the genesis of that idea. Two more new locations complete the set for Forza 3, but they don't really share the same concept of a shared location. Benchmark High Speed Ring, a name I'm slightly surprised they were allowed to get away with, was distributed similarly to the Sidewinder Proving Grounds, and so is technically DLC, but as the name suggests, this is much more about testing and benchmarking your cars than actually racing. There's an oval speedway, but other than that, just a few basic loops and some drag strips laid out on an airfield for taking your tuned cars for a spin. I can't say it wasn't fun to take this weird little beast out on this SNES Mario Circuit 1 looking track and absolutely demolish it, but it's not a racetrack, you know? Finally, we have Sedona Raceway Park, a fictional coliseum of an oval speedway in the Arizona desert with a road course in the Motegi tradition. The club circuit takes place in the shadow of the speedway, with red rock formations defining the layout and huge mesas to admire in the background, while the full circuit threads through the vomitoria to connect the two parts. The defining feature of this track, whichever section you're driving on, is that you never know where to brake. The oval joins the infield with some very harsh angles, and the camber on some of the road course's corners can easily spit you into the sand, even if you think you've done the job. A series of drag strips at different lengths completes the selection, so Sedona is really a complex for racing of almost all kinds. Maybe that's more what its defining quality should be. All of this brings Forza 3's total to 25 different locations and 138 track configurations, almost 3 times as many as the last game. Forza was becoming a titan of the simcade genre and one of the tentpole Xbox exclusives, with massive growth in content and quality and a consistent release schedule to boot. The real-world tracks were still flooding in, but the team were now starting to experiment with concepts of a connected world, potentially sowing the seeds for new horizons to come. It certainly helped that Gran Turismo 5 was still not out by this point, prologue notwithstanding, so Forza got to carry the torch for console racing games in the first HD generation. The series arguably reached its peak in terms of reputation and popularity with Forza Motorsport 4, the final game in the series on the Xbox 360, released in 2011. This game feels like it's testing the waters for experiments that the series would go all in on going into the next generation, which makes it a really interesting middle ground with certain hallmarks of both the eras that came before and after. Presentation has been changed up again, with Forza 3's stark white giving way to a sort of brushed metal aesthetic, very typical of the early 2010s, and for me it does feel a little bit generic for a racing game. It's all laid out the same under that coat of paint, so I do kind of miss the bold minimalism. That minimalism instead now lives on the in-game HUD, with floating text and a pretty basic font. The exception is in an understated addition to the series, a grading system for how you're driving. Whether it's how well you took a corner, how long you slipstreamed someone, how close you passed them, or how well you held a drift, the game now pops up a little rating out of 4 to let you know how you're doing. Its scoring system is very opaque. The pass score feels less like a rating on the subjective quality of the overtake and more just how close did you get while you did it, while the turn score seems to focus pretty rigidly on how closely you stuck to the ideal racing line, with no real interest in how much speed you could carry. The career mode has been shaken up again as well, now going under the moniker World Tour, and focusing on a career in international motorsport, while a couple of new additions act as technical showpieces. Auto Vista is a brand new mode of sorts, allowing you to explore a selection of cars in pretty granular detail, interior and exterior alike, with recorded voiceover providing all the information about each car you could ever want. This mode also shows off a pretty big get for the series, a partnership with Top Gear. Every car, except for the Halo Warthog, which was added in an update, has a separate piece of narration from Jeremy Clarkson to listen to.
A bespoke gearbox and a body made of carbon fibre. We take that for granted in supercars now, but back in the early 90s, it was so extraordinary they might as well have made it from lumps of Jupiter.
This, more than anything else, shows you how much Forza had grown in relation to Gran Turismo by this point, as the Top Gear license actually switched sides following its appearance in Gran Turismo 5. The Clarksonisms do seem just a little bit out of place in a game that otherwise takes itself pretty seriously, but I speak from experience in saying that if you were 14 in 2011, this was the coolest thing ever.
Racing is in McLaren's DNA.
The other new mode shows itself off on the front of the box. Forza 4 is a first-party Xbox game from 2011, so obviously it claims to be better with Kinect. Ah, go on then. I've never actually used a Kinect before, but I have a vague idea what to expect here. Look, there I am! The game detects the Kinect on startup and lets you either continue with the controller or wave at it to access the Kinect-only mode, which is what I tried first. The menus have been Kinectified, with much bigger selection elements and really finicky swipe-to-scroll motions. I'll get the requisite Kinect thing that doesn't work out of the way first. Auto Vista didn't work for me at all, because my living room isn't big enough for me to fit in the frame if I stand up like it wants me to. I'm just spinning around this thing. Somehow it still picked up the fact that I sat down to quit. It's a haunting view, really. That's not all though, you can even drive with Kinect. You can pick any car or track for this, and to be honest, for what it is, it does work. You're stuck with the cockpit view and racing lines on, which is kind of weird because obviously it accelerates and brakes for you anyway, so essentially all you're doing is just miming a steering wheel. Like I say, it works for what it is, but obviously you get no real feedback, and just holding your arms up doing nothing definitely makes you ache after a while, so it's a pretty pointless mode, which you might not be surprised to find out. What is genuinely quite fun though, is the mode that you get if you start with a controller while the Kinect is plugged in. In this mode, you get to play the game as normal, but with Kinect doing some head tracking. I had to sit on the floor to get it tracking my head to any reasonable degree, but it was pretty cool to look into the apex of the corner and have the camera go where I was looking. You do have to make quite exaggerated movements to make it happen, and I wasn't able to look far enough to the side to check my far mirror, but for glancing in the driver's side mirror and that little bit of immersion, I was honestly quite impressed by this. When I said earlier that Forza 4 feels like the start of the next generation in some ways, what I meant by that is in the way that it handles its track selection. From now until Forza 7, the way it's going to work is that there's one new fictional track that gets used in all the marketing as a sort of showpiece, along with a few new real-life circuits and a selection of the circuits from previous games. That means that there are a few unfortunate removals between Forza 3 and 4. The Sidewinder Proving Grounds are no more, meaning the legacy of Gran Turismo 3's complex string comes to an end here. The Rally di Positano circuit technically returns, but it's actually what was called Amalfi Coast in Forza 3. The super long multi-stage track has been removed, and its name given to the short slice of it instead. New York circuit is missing too, spelling an end to the Forza 1 era city tracks. And lastly, although the Le Mans circuit returns, the Bugatti circuit contained within it is no longer an option. Everything else does return from 3 in one form or another. I'll get my nitpicking negativity out of the way first, but there are a few tracks that are lifted straight out of Forza 3 with no updates made. I feel kind of bad complaining too hard about this considering the games came out just 2 years apart, but the ones that stand out to me are the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit and Silverstone. Something about Nürburgring didn't look quite right to me in 3 either, and the exact same track is here in 4 as well, which makes sense considering it was DLC for 3, but the lighting just looks a bit off to me. The grass looks distractingly low res for some reason, and they still haven't got the sign up at the Michael Schumacher S. Yes, this really does bother me. Silverstone is the same as it ever was, but that's also kind of my problem with it here. The new layout of the track in real life came in 2010, but in this 2011 game it's still using the old version. These are just kind of strange examples of cut corners to me, no pun intended. Everything else is back again, but I mean that one in a good way. The remaining facets of Forza 3's combined world are still here, from the intriguing village of Fujimi Kaido to the Montserrat complex, and there's even been a few changes to returning locations. By that, I really just mean that Maple Valley now has this little covered area on top of the crossover, but it's nice to get even a bit more character out of tracks we've seen since the very beginning. So, if Forza 4 introduces the concept of one headline new fictional track, let's take a look at it. The Bernese Alps circuit is a real technical showcase, in a similar way to Montserrat in some ways, with breathtaking mountain vistas on a road that could of course never host a race in real life. I wonder if the Swiss government knows their ban on circuit racing was being virtually flouted like this. The route takes you past glistening mountain lakes, through a small village, on some of the longer layouts through a tunnel in the mountain itself, but always starting and finishing a lap at a ski resort, complete with cable cars going on in the background. The circuit itself is an extremely high-speed affair, with the core of the circuit essentially forming a loose double oval that branches out for a sweeping run over the mountains. Whether you pick the club circuit, the Stadtplatz, or the full festival circuit, basically just dictates how much of the back section of the track you cut out. Like with Montserrat, this track serves as the cold open for the career mode, and if I'm honest, it does feel like a track designed for flair rather than to be a good racetrack. You can do pretty well in a race here if all you know how to do is accelerate and steer, is what I'm saying. The other added tracks in Forza 4, a bit like Forza 2 actually, serve to bump up the series' pedigree in terms of real tracks. 4 real circuits make their series debut here, and we'll start with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, an incredibly famous venue to be added to the series, and I like that it also includes the road course, but it gets me raising my eyebrows slightly nonetheless. IMS is here, but there's no Indy cars to drive, not even any real stock cars. I don't really have anything insightful to say about that, it's just kind of odd that there's no way to simulate an Indy 500, even though the actual track is here. Forza 3 had this problem as well, to be fair, because there's so much flavor text referring to F1 in that game, but there's no F1 cars to drive. Anyway, this is the Brickyard in all its glory, but I was interested to see that it's the period-accurate version of the road course, where the double hairpins have been removed, but it's still got the full banking for the final corner. It is interesting to me that Sunset Peninsula is still here now that Indy is as well. One of only 3 Forza 1 originals to have survived this far, still in the game when a real oval with a real infield road course that, to my mind, provided the inspiration for the made-up one is now part of it as well. The other addition from the world of US racing is Sonoma Raceway, here going by its name at the time of Infineon Raceway. There's 3 layouts to choose from, and again it manages to name drop the Indy Racing League and NASCAR by referring to the layouts those series used in their races here, in addition to the long course. Whichever you pick, I do really like this track, and I don't think that's a super common opinion. I understand that it doesn't always make for great racing in real life, but given a virtual representation it almost feels like a track that shouldn't exist. The start of the lap is nothing but uphill corners with blind exits. The middle part, which the NASCAR layout skips, dumps you onto an airstrip of a back straight with a weirdly clumsy hairpin, before an undulating series of S's brings you right up against the wall with a final corner that couldn't be any closer to the boundary of the circuit complex itself. Every lap feels like an adventure, and it feels like something that was designed by a racing game developer rather than a real motorsport venue, in a positive way. Continuing a trend from Forza 3 of introducing world-class European circuits, Forza 4 introduces the Hockenheim Ring to the series. The alternate host of the German Grand Prix at the time has 3 layouts to race, all including the first corner, the Nord Curve, and the stadium section surrounding the Sachs Curve. The short circuit is interesting because it turns the whole thing into a test of handling, pretty much, although the layout does look a little bit sus. The national circuit has always kind of confused me though, because the only real difference between it and the full Grand Prix circuit is how far down the curved back straight you go before a hairpin. I guess you do cut the Daredevil run out of that hairpin into the Mercedes section, which I do love, but maybe I'm just not a circuit designer enough to understand why you really need this. I also always feel that it's a wasted opportunity when racing games get Hockenheim but don't include the old course, you know, the blast through the trees with nothing but a few chicanes to break it up. I know it's almost certainly a licensing thing, I'm not actually marking it down for not having it because almost nothing does after 2001, and it wasn't actually that good a track if you really think about it anyway, but if you've made it this far, you know I like my options for this sort of thing. The last new track for Forza 4 expands on that little Top Gear partnership I mentioned earlier, because it's the Top Gear test track at Dunsfold. This is probably what I thought was most exciting about this game at the time. Like a lot of people, I wasn't really a car guy, and back in 2011 I still wasn't really interested in real racing either, but I loved Top Gear, and getting the chance to be my own stick and drive all of these cars around somewhere I knew reasonably well from TV, but not from this sort of angle, was incredibly cool. There's a few surprising layout options as well, most of which I'm pretty sure were never really used on the show, but the route is split into its constituent loops, along with the curious outer loop, which defies the figure 8 by sending you the wrong way through the follow-through and hammerhead to make a back straight out of the entire runway. It's the full circuit you're really here for though, and I remember finding it just as much of a novelty to race it as to hot lap it. They never used to do actual races on the track because it is a figure 8, so if you're able to get a long enough race and the field is spread out a bit, you could get traffic crossing over as some brake for Chicago while others went flat through the tyres, making the whole thing into a fun challenge of survival. Anyway, Jeremy Clarkson's a twat. The total numbers for Forza 4 are 27 locations with 126 configurations. That number does include the Benchmark High Speed Ring, which is also known in this game as Test Track Benchmark, and was technically DLC, but it came free with the game when it came out. The same applies to the Top Gear football pitch, which isn't really a racetrack, but it's got some minigames and stuff you can do on it. Anyway, that comes out to a reduction in available circuits since Forza 3, mostly because of the removal of Sidewinder Proving Grounds and the full Rally di Positano, so it's up to you what to make of that. It does look like more according to the number of possible selections in-game, but that's because some of them are repeats of the different time of day or cloud cover. And if I've sounded weirdly disappointed during this segment, it's probably because I kind of am. I haven't played Forza 4 in a long time, but if you talk to anyone who despairs about the state of the franchise after this generation, they'll tell you that this was where the series peaked, so I was looking forward to rediscovering it. Instead, I found a game that hallmarks some of the problems the series will go on to have in the future, and doesn't really celebrate the entire series so far. I do like the additions in this game, but there are certain things that I think 3 does better, and I was just a bit surprised to figure that out. The way the Xbox One launched has been covered in depth already, but I'm stepping into the unknown here by talking about one of the games that actually came out with the console in November 2013. Yes, Forza was a launch title for the next generation, and amid some of the other offerings at the time, it was one of the bigger names. It's also, to draw the comparison again, something Gran Turismo couldn't manage, as numbered titles practically skipped the PS4 generation. And hey, while we're at it, feast your eyes on the lesser spotted Xbox One exclusive. God knows this game needs whatever superlatives it can get, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Ultimately, the thing about Forza 5 is that it exists pretty much solely so that there could be something Forza on the Xbox One at launch, because racing games have historically made for good launch titles due to being a good way to show off the new console's graphics. What that leaves us with is a pretty bare bones game in terms of content, although it does certainly look nice. The career mode has been stripped well back, with none of the season-focused stuff from Forza 3 and 4, instead going back to just a checklist of themed events, shuttling you between races and one-off events with no real context. This is my abiding memory of playing this game at the time. It just felt like the game was shuffling through whatever content it had in just a never-ending conveyor belt of the same tracks and the same cars, with a nightmare DLC model on top of it all to boot. I haven't really been mentioning the DLC situation when it comes to cars. Ever since Forza 2, of course, that's been a thing. Because I'm not really so much of a car guy, it's never bothered me to have an incomplete selection. Forza 5 was, in hindsight, one of the first monetization nightmare games I ever experienced, because it is everywhere here. Cars that were available as paid DLC are visible in the menus even if you don't buy them, and the AI opponents can also use them, but they take up space in the car list just to make you aware of what you don't have. There's also premium currency in this game. You see that 0TK at the top of the screen there? Tokens, as they're called, work alongside the series standard credits and could be purchased for real money. The primary use of tokens was to give you an XP booster for a certain amount of time. Ridiculous and unnecessary, really. The servers for this game don't even work anymore, and none of the DLC is purchasable even if they did. So if you play this game today, there is no avoiding this stuff just getting in your way. Really, the only thing aside from the graphics that you can say is actually improved over Forza 4 is that the renamed Forza Vista mode allows you close examination and exploration of every car in the game instead of just a small selection. I've no doubt this sort of detail impacted on the final amount of cars available in the game, and if so, I debate how useful of a feature this really is, but it's nice that every car gets the same treatment at least. The track selection is a real clean break moment from what came before. There are some returning tracks, but out of the 27 locations from Forza 4, at launch, only 9 of them returned for Forza 5. And of those 9, only a single fictional track is still here. Bernese Alps looks absolutely lovely in the next-gen graphics, and it's had a few interesting facelifts on the trackside decorations as well, but it's still not my favourite track in the world, so it's kind of a shame that it's the only survivor of previous Forza original tracks. While we're on the original track front, we may as well talk about the new ones, because there's only 2. The new showcase track is Prague, with a circuit on the cobbled streets of the old town, crossing tram tracks and bridges with a super narrow run between the buildings to close out the lap. The full circuit takes you up the steep hills of the castle grounds before plunging back down into the city, with some challenging corners up there that give this layout a hint of the old Montjuic circuit in Barcelona. I actually really like this track. It's a similar idea to Bernese Alps, making the point that, as this is a video game, why not make a racetrack that would never actually exist? Why not allow supercars and race cars to zip through narrow medieval streets with no regard to protecting historical buildings or stopping traffic? What makes this one work for me is that this is actually fun to race on. The wide corners provide multiple lines into the tighter braking zones, and it just feels less, I don't know, monotonous than a lap of Bernese Alps. The other new original track here is Test Track Airfield. I've forgotten all about this one, to be honest. I expected it to be a renamed version of the benchmark test track from the last couple of games, but that's not what it is at all. Instead, this is a small course around an airfield with several different paths to try around the lap. I think this is more a venue for some of the career mode challenges rather than a racetrack, but it is actually quite fun to race on anyway. So that means 8 real-world tracks from Forza 4 made the jump. This game boasts the introduction of laser scanning circuits to the series, but as usual, when a racing game promises that, there's always some argument about which ones and how well they manage to do it. As far as I know, it does have it, in some capacity anyway. Catalunya, Laguna Seca, Road Atlanta, Sebring, and the Top Gear track are here with all the same layouts as before, and so is Indianapolis, which makes a lot more sense now that there's a suite of IndyCars to drive on it. The remaining 2 do actually have a couple of changes. Le Mans returns again here, decked out in the Forza sponsorships by the way, but after being left out of Forza 4, the Bugatti circuit is now back, which is nice. Silverstone is the last returning track, but with the next gen bump it is now in its modern incarnation. Again, I kind of wish games like this could let you race the old version if you wanted to, but it's definitely starting to feel a bit modern now. The Silverstone National layout is the same as it ever was, but the new International layout cuts from the infield onto the hangar straight, which gives the effect of a shorter track for smaller events, the same flavour of the refurbished circuit, so I don't mind it. Along with those came 3 new real-world circuits. In case it wasn't already clear, this is by far and away the priority when it comes to this game, but in fairness, they picked some good ones to bring into the series for the first time. The Mount Panorama circuit makes its series debut, 8 years after Forza 1 had a pseudo-unlicensed version of it, and this is a real classic track. I'm really bad at it and always have been, but clearly I just haven't conquered the mountain well enough to commit to the blind uphill run. The top of the mountain is one of the craziest sections of track in the world, and the challenge of carrying the speed through Forest's Elbow and down the Conrod to close out the lap is incredible. Yas Marina circuit has been, for better or worse, a mainstay of the F1 calendar since 2009, and its inclusion here comes alongside the 2013 Lotus F1 car. Microsoft had started sponsoring the team back in 2012, so keep an eye out for Team Enstone in the next few games here. This track is a lot better since the 2021 reprofiling that got rid of all the pointless chicanes, and that's all there really is to say. There are a few layout options as well though. The fairly standard options for north or south circuits chopping the track in half, but what I found interesting was the corkscrew layout, which cuts off turn 3 for what I guess you could charitably call a corkscrew down to halfway along the back straight. It's funny because it's not really that much shorter of a lap than the full circuit, unless you do the corkscrew north variant anyway. The last newly introduced track is perhaps the best of the bunch, Spa. I know it's a basic opinion, but I absolutely love this track. Eau Rouge and Radion speak for themselves. I've also always really liked the challenges of the downhill braking into Bruxelles, the grip demands of Pouhon, and trying to take Blanchimont flat. And that was it, at least at first. 14 tracks, only about half of what was in the previous game, definitely explains the feeling of repetitiveness I remember feeling when I was playing this back in the day. But in an unusual twist, the track list expansions in this game came as part of free content updates. If there was any game I would have expected to do this as paid DLC, this would be it. Nonetheless, the first content update came with Road America, which somehow makes its second appearance as DLC despite also being part of the series since the very beginning. For the first time though, it has some different layouts to play with. The east route straight lines turn 5 in a way that never feels quite right to me, while the west route does the opposite, as you'd imagine, but also has some weirdness for turn 5 where the normal curb is right in the middle of the corner. The full circuit and west route also offer an alternate route, which is normally used for motorcycles, but if you want to do a chicane instead of the kink, here you go. The second DLC track is a new addition to the series, but also an iconic American circuit, Long Beach. This track comes alive in an IndyCar, admittedly mostly just because of the high speed, but the iconic tight corners around the fountain and the ridiculous hairpin that ends the lap gives it a memorable quality in its own right. The east route here is similar to what would go on to be the Formula E track, but I could never quite get the breaking point for this cut through here. The west route gets the short end of the stick to a degree, and I don't know if this was ever actually used in real life, but it turns this section of track into an almost demolition derby style runaround, and I kinda like it. The third and final DLC track was the Nürburgring, meaning it too now has an appearance in every game so far. For the first time, the Nordschleife and the Grand Prix circuit are considered the same location, so you can race the full combined circuit. I'm pleased to report my petty complaints about the trackside decorations have been fixed as well, and they've finally put the start line in the right place. Unfortunately, it does come at the expense of the Grand Prix circuit short variant, which is a bit strange. And that's Forza 5. 17 tracks, and I've had it with this game. I had a lot I thought about saying here, but I did promise this wouldn't be about doing full reviews. I do feel this is the weakest point in the series though, but that said it is still fundamentally fine to play, just like any Forza Motorsport game. I try not to be negative when I can help it, so to put a positive spin on all of this, the new generation was certainly a break from tradition. If Forza is now going to pursue a selection of world-class real-life circuits, it's good that they've got the cars to take advantage of that now. Plus, there wouldn't be long to wait for a better attempt. Seems strange to think about considering where the industry is nowadays, but they were pumping these games out around this time. For most of the 2010s, Forza was an annual franchise, alternating Motorsport and Horizon releases, so if Motorsport 5 disappointed you, the next game was only a couple of years away. Of course, we complained about that at the time as well, but the grass is always greener, huh? A long time ago, at the start of this video, I mentioned that Forza was what I was playing at the moment I realised I like real racing as well. More specifically, it was Forza Motorsport 6. It kinda came at the perfect time for me. It was released just before my 18th birthday when I got my first car. It continues the trend that Forza 5 started, for better or worse, of going all in on real circuits. The career mode is a little more linear and a lot more themed, focusing on stories of motorsport, with my favourite parts being the driver experiences that give you fully themed events. I think it was doing this IndyCar experience on the Speedway that altered my brain chemistry all those years ago. Up to 24 cars in a race and some surprisingly aggressive AI, which becomes dangerous if you turn off the limited aggression, felt like a break from the racing games I was used to, where the lead is never that far away. It feels better to play. Forza 5 was floaty and understeery, with a camera that seemed like it was focusing more on being cinematic than showing you where to go, while 6 is a lot more no-nonsense and all the better for it. I'm not trying to say this is the best game ever made, of course. The AI, while challenging, is still extremely stupid a lot of the time, and seems unable to control the faster cars through certain corners on certain tracks. The confusing and pointless mods system allows you to do things like give yourself 10% more grip, or force you to turn off some assist in exchange for a bigger payout, which takes away from the otherwise consistent upgrade and tuning system. And I don't really like the new fictional track. On that note, Forza Motorsport 6's new circuit is also in some ways a returning one. Rio de Janeiro was one of the original circuits way back in the first game, and that city plays host to the new track 10 years later. Unfortunately, there's not even a reference to the original track here, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity, but whatever. The new circuit is set on the waterfront of the Guanabara Bay, in the shadows of Corcovado and Christ the Redeemer. It might seem like the obvious choices, but it makes the circuit feel more like Rio than the original version did. Or at least my stereotype of what Rio looks like. I've never been there myself. The track climbs uphill into the mountains before descending to the tight coast loop section, with its weird triangular curves and choke points that the AI doesn't understand. Like with all the recent prestige tracks, I think this looks spectacular, and I still love the concept of designing a racetrack that could technically exist but never realistically would. But something about this track doesn't do it for me. The flavor text tells you to watch for braking zones because you'll get distracted by the rich scenery and all that, and I guess they're correct because I was bouncing into every wall on the track. As for the rest of the tracks, I'm pleased to report that nothing has been removed since the last game. Everything from Forza 5 carries over to 6, which effectively means that there is no need to ever play 5 except for performance art. Some of the returning tracks have had a bit of a glow up to boot. Some very tedious nerd changes are that the Nürburgring full layout now uses the old style turn 1, like a 24-hour race does in real life, while the Indianapolis road course has been updated to the modern IndyCar version with the flat chicane. Indianapolis also now has what it calls the Alt layout, which is actually the MotoGP course, similar to the normal road course, but notably skipping all bankings and running in the opposite direction. Forza 6 also introduces something brand new for the series, weather and night racing. Forza 4 had a few tracks with the option of running at sunrise, sunset, or under heavy cloud, but that basically just changed the skybox. These versions are a bit more involved. For tracks used in endurance racing or synonymous with night racing in general, Forza 6 now offers these as a variant, which turns the Nürburgring into a horror game and makes Yas Marina look true to the deadest days of any Formula 1 season. Several tracks also offer a wet weather variation, but with this in particular you can see some obvious limitations with this feature. The time of day and the weather are not dynamic. Day will never turn to night, it will never start raining on a dry track, and it will never stop raining on a wet track. The rain itself isn't dynamic either. It's not simulating rainfall, it's just lower grip everywhere with a few crazy puddles of standing water that cause instant aquaplaning. The AI struggle with Silverstone's Vale Corner in this game as it is, but put a puddle before it and half the field will end up in the wall. On top of the returning tracks from Forza 5, 6 also brings back some tracks from Forza 4, allowing them to make their Xbox One debut. Hockenheim and Sonoma return, with all the layout options as before, but Sonoma now no longer name drops specific racing series in its layouts, which is all the funnier now that there are actually licensed cars you could use on it. There are also 6 real circuits making their first appearance in the Forza series. Brands Hatch is a cool track, very historic, but also an important part of British motorsport particularly. I've never really got on with the iconic Paddock Hill bend fully, but that's my own skill issue. The narrow ribbon of tarmac that takes you around the back of the circuit with its high speed yet sharp angle corners is great though, and I love how deceptively fast you can take Sheen Curve. The Indy circuit skips over my favourite part, but it's a very high speed course for such a cramped layout, and that makes races interesting on it anyway. The only other new appearance by a European circuit is Monza. The Temple of Speed is one of those tracks that gets elevated by its drivable appearances in games like this, because you get the smallest insight into what it's like to drive it, rather than watching the not always brilliant racing it produces in real life. There's a layout option to remove the first chicane if you fancy avoiding certain death on lap 1, and also the seldom seen short circuit, where you cut through from the main straight onto the back straight. Why don't these cowardly racing games ever let you drive on the 100-year-old crumbling oval? The remaining 4 new tracks are all American, and between them they cover pretty much every level of racing, which is pretty cool. Lime Rock Park is one of the cooler pulls this series has made, a track not that well known outside of North America, mostly known for sports car and junior level racing. It's quite a high speed track with only a handful of corners, but it's got my favourite type of corner, a downhill run that if you get right you can just about take flat and set up a move into the long hairpin. There are 4 layout options here, allowing you to run with none of the optional chicanes, both of them, or one of them depending on what you're feeling. These chicanes are obviously intended to slow down the faster cars that compete here, and it makes an interesting battle spot out of the top of the hill. Watkins Glen is a classic track, with pedigree of Formula 1, NASCAR and IMSA among countless others. Setting up through the S's to try and get a run down the back straight is always fun, as is hanging on through the loop to carry as much speed as possible. I've never really got on with the boot too much. I think it's the corner at the end, where it's hard to see exactly where you should be looking to go, but I do really like the drop down into the complex, and the multiple lines you can take through there, so it's hard to say whether I prefer the full or short circuit. You can also opt to remove the chicane if you want the classic experience. Circuit of the Americas was only 3 years old when this game came out, making this one of its earliest appearances in video games at all, I think only beaten by the annual F1 and MotoGP games. This is one of the few Tilkodromes people actually quite like, and all it took was a big hill and intentionally copying corners from other tracks. No shame though, this track is a roller coaster, and I say that with approval. That said, my favourite part might be the slower section after the back straight, which was designed to allow for multiple lines in close battling. The circuit can also be split in two if you fancy it. The west route cuts into the end of the straight after most of the S's, while the east route takes place entirely on the rest of the back straight and the remaining S. They could theoretically host two races at once. Lastly, Daytona makes its debut in Forza here. Across endurance and stock car racing alike, this is one of the most famous racetracks in America, so its appearance here makes total sense with the new focus on the stories of motorsport. The famous Tri-Oval is here, as is the sports car circuit, and I've always loved the dedication you need to throw into the chicane, as weird as that sounds, but also there's a layout curiously titled Short Circuit. I don't think I've ever seen it before. It turns out that this is the old motorcycle layout, last used in 2008, although they use the chicane and this version doesn't. I don't know what it's doing here, but as I said before, I always appreciate the options. That would be it, were it not for the delicate question of tracks as paid DLC once again. Yet, for all you can say about Forza 5, at least you didn't have to pay for new tracks. The Virginia International Raceway and Homestead Miami Speedway were added to Forza 6 as part of larger paid expansions, the Porsche expansion and the NASCAR expansion respectively. As you can see, I didn't buy those expansions, and now I can't because they've all been delisted. I can't say I'm surprised that 18-year-old me didn't have 30 quid to spare on expanding one of my favourite games of the generation. No, really. But by all accounts, these expansions are supposed to be pretty good, and my game is forever incomplete for my mistakes. Nonetheless, with those DLC tracks, which we'll cover in depth in a bit, Forza 6 has 28 different track locations, which is a new record for the series. I fully accept that without the original tracks, and with a bit of that 2010s microtransaction stank still hanging around, Forza 6 isn't exactly a new dawn for the series, but for me it hit at exactly the time I needed to, and I can never feel that badly about it as a result. This was a strange time with the Forza Motorsport series. Seeing as it was any year after 2009, it was a strange time for Xbox in fairness. In the 2 years between Forza 6 and 7, a lot had changed behind the scenes. In 2016, Xbox began to release their games day and date on PC alongside console, and 2017 saw the launch of Xbox Game Pass. Although the whole day one on Game Pass thing wouldn't start until a year later, these two policy changes are basically the genesis of whatever you call Xbox have got going on right now. And all the while, Xbox first parties still had that stink of annual Halo, Gears and Forza being pumped out to a disinterested audience. It was a harsh climate to launch the 7th entry in quite a niche series, especially considering that Forza Horizon was also really starting to take off. The success of Forza Horizon 3 in particular is all over Motorsport 7, and my personal feelings about Horizon 3 aside, I think we can all agree those series play to different strengths. All I'm saying is that after 6 games of quite dry presentation in one form or another, this game opens on your custom driver in unlockable or purchasable cosmetics doing idle dances to the sounds of generic rock music being played from the other room. And yet there are some gameplay changes I really do like here. The career mode is now known as the Forza Drivers' Cup, and has the closest thing yet to a motorsport ladder type of progression. You can set the duration for career mode races at last, meaning you no longer have to smash your way to the front in 3 laps for every career race. The weather and lighting systems have been improved, meaning you get some nice sunsets on races ostensibly at daylight, and dynamic-ish weather on certain tracks. Unfortunately, there's still no actual day-to-night progression, and although you can set how rain progresses during a race, you can't actually choose a time of day, so it's not perfect. This game is also pretty infamous for its AI, which, by the way, are all drivatars now. They're not as stupid as 6 is, but they rubber band like crazy, and in career mode are pretty notorious for basically just meaning that higher difficulty gives them a straight line speed boost. So let's get to the tracks, and let's start by saying that this continues Forza 6's innovation of keeping everything from the previous game, DLC included. That means we can actually look at the tracks that were added as DLC in 6. Virginia International Raceway is a really interesting pull, and another track I would have never really known about if not for its appearances in Forza. It's a very European style of racetrack for being in America, with elevation changes and varied corners giving it that feeling that every lap has something going on, which is what I really like in a racetrack. The ribbon of tarmac with some very subtle turns after the first little complex is a really cool challenge of high-speed needle threading, and the tricky downhill braking into the final corner is just the right side of annoying that it always makes you want to try again. All the real-world layouts are here, from the north course that crests a hill to cut the track in half, the tiny south and Patriot courses, and both versions of the Grand course that combines everything into one big track. It's cool that the same idea of combining all the infield variants of a track has two different layout choices itself, depending on where you want the crossover points to be. The other former DLC track, now part of the main game, is Homestead Miami Speedway. It would be easy to say as a silly European that Daytona makes this track obsolete, but I do appreciate having more oval options, because every oval still has its own character. It's a 1.5 mile oval as opposed to Daytona and Indianapolis, which are 2.5 mile super speedways, and that changes the way the infield road course feels as well. Although the layout just looks like it's crisscrossing streets with hairpins and a chicane to finish, it doesn't really feel like that somehow. You might have noticed I like my do or die high speed corners, so you bet I like the plunge off the oval straight that almost feels like you can do it flat, but you'd be brave to try it. Along with the oval and the road course, you can also race a short circuit that takes place on the first sector of the track, a super mini circuit consisting entirely of the back straight and one of the oval sections, and a couple of surprising combo tracks, at least one of which does actually exist in real life. You can drive the road course but using turn 3 and 4 of the oval instead of the final sector, or what I think is funnier, the oval speedway that uses the final sector of the road course instead. This feels so deeply unsafe as a racetrack that I just think is funny, and I can't see any evidence of it being used in real life for anything either. And apart from those, everything else is as it was in Forza 6. Hockenheim now has wet weather as an option, and COTA can be raced at night, but otherwise it's all pretty much the same. The Top Gear partnership is still technically holding on, but it's so de-emphasized in this game it's almost funny. Forza 6 released post-Fracas, but still had plenty of Top Gear branded stuff. But by 2017 it clearly no longer had the brand appeal it once did, so the track is here almost as an afterthought. What we do have is a few tracks making their first appearance of this generation, having last appeared in Forza Motorsport 4 back on the Xbox 360. Suzuka and Mugello have both been mainstays of the series during that era, so it's nice to see them back, if only because better late than never. Mugello, visual upgrade aside, is the same as it ever was, but Suzuka has a wet weather option, as well as a new layout variation, in the form of the motorcycle circuit. This version of the track puts a chicane in the middle of 200R, or the curve after the hairpin if you prefer, while also using the second of the chicane setup at the Casio Triangle. From what I know, this version of the track doesn't ever really get used for any car races, but you know me by now, I like having the option. Lastly, Forza 7 marks the long overdue return of Maple Valley Raceway. These last few games have felt a bit like Forza was embarrassed by its past of needing original circuits to fill in for real life ones, so I'm not sure whether this return is celebratory or begrudging. Nonetheless, the makeover here feels like a modernisation that's certainly appropriate for the vibe of this series at the moment. Rather than feeling like a race on some disused farmland, this feels like an actual racetrack, as such a thing might actually be built. Not like as in Gran Turismo Sport style. Hi gang, it's me in the edit. I just wanted to clarify a statement that I just made there. I thought previously that the changes that Gran Turismo Sport made to the track designs of certain classic tracks like High Speed Ring and Trial Mountain were because the FIA told them to do it. In my mind, I thought that those tracks had to be turned into, like, what if these tracks were real? There's actually no evidence for that being why those tracks were redesigned, so this point of comparison is, in fact, not valid. Sorry about that. But in the sense that grandstands line the slow corners and the start-finish straight, the track is wider all over, campsites and camera operators line the infield, and the pit lane is on the inside, like most real tracks would have had it. The character of the original circuit hasn't been altered too much, although that move's pit lane does change the first corner a little bit, now that the old narrowness is no longer a factor. It looks nice in the rain too, and the slightly more realistic design doesn't prevent you from running the track in reverse, at least. All of that means that Forza 7 actually only has one brand new track, and it's the headline fictional city track once again. This time it's Dubai. Not the most inspiring city, and definitely not one that needs the advertising. It's not even the real life Dubai Autodrome. This is a circuit of two halves, where the city portion is an incredibly bland track that doesn't even look that much like Dubai unless you squint to see the Burj Khalifa in the background, and the mountain portion is, in my experience at least, practically undrivable. I remember playing this game on launch day and loading into the traditional first race of career mode, doing a lap of the full circuit in the Porsche 911 cover car, and thinking it was just one of the worst experiences I'd ever had on these games. I don't want to dwell on it, but I just really don't like this track. So that's quite a complicated legacy for Forza Motorsport 7. It has the most content of any game in the series so far, with the returning set of tracks from 4 alongside everything from 6, giving it a pretty strong track list, and like with every game, it's still fundamentally perfectly fine to play. And yet, for every good decision, there's a Dubai, there's a fake difficulty on the AI, there's a confusing presentation style that feels like it's trying too hard to appeal to everyone. In 2017, there was a factor of paying full price for not that much new content. For the first time in series history, Forza Motorsport would not return 2 years later, and obviously there's more to that than just the way this game was received, but it was forced to carry the torch for 6 years, despite being delisted after only 4. The first Forza Motorsport wilderness years were upon us. Nothing's ever really gone though, and in the build up to launch for the Xbox Series X and S, Forza Motorsport was announced to be coming back. They then kind of kept announcing that it was coming back without actually showing much of the game until it was eventually released almost 3 years after the console itself, or at least that's how it felt to me. This was intended as something of a rebirth for the motorsport games. The logo was redesigned after almost 15 years, it's not called Forza Motorsport 8, and as we'll get to in a minute, the structure and content on offer was completely different from the previous entries. It was kind of another clean break moment as the series entered its 4th console generation, but to cut a long story short, it feels like they might have been better never than late in the end. Now, I want it known early doors here that I genuinely really like this game, at least as it is now, in its most likely feature complete state, and after several content updates that put a little more meat on its bones. At launch, it was kind of a different story. The career mode has been stripped down to what feels like its barest implementation of any game in the series. Where Forza 7 had the Drivers' Cup, Forza 2023 calls its career the Builders' Cup. That's because the big gameplay change here is that they've completely changed the way upgrading your car works. At the small picture level, the system of rating you on your cornering and overtaking ability that's been around since Forza 4 has now been expanded into a car XP system. Overtaking, clean racing, and your overall performance around each sector of the track earns you experience towards your car level, where each level up unlocks new upgrades you can install between races that you pay for with dedicated car points. But simply, you don't use the same money for buying cars and buying upgrades for your cars anymore. Bigger picture, that leads to one of the most controversial things about this game. You can't buy a car and upgrade it straight away, because car points are only for use with a single car and can't be transferred around. If you want to max out a car's potential, you have to drive it until you've leveled up and buy whatever upgrades you can afford incrementally during the process. Now, I have to admit, this doesn't massively affect how I like to play these games. The Builders' Cup is structured so that the car performance limit goes up with every race, so you can just spend what you've got and be assured that basically everyone's going to be upgrading at the same pace you are, and even if you run a free play, this still applies as well. So if you just wanted to simulate a championship and don't mind starting from scratch, then at worst, this just doesn't make much difference. That said, I've said multiple times that options are always better, so making it like this removes the option to buy a car and race it fully spec'd straight away, which means I don't think it's a good idea. So even though that wasn't an issue for me, I still dropped this game not long after I first picked it up. It wasn't out of sheer empathy for people who didn't like the car XP system, And it wasn't even because I was disappointed with the built from the ground up debacle. As I mentioned right at the start of this video, I'm not a car guy, so the well documented and pretty embarrassing issues of model reuse and downgrades genuinely passed me by. Instead, it was ironically because there was so little to do that I didn't feel motivated to even complete it. This was all you had at the start, with a rotating selection of live service extras before all the actual video game ran out, and you were just left to do the Forza Horizon or Gran Turismo 7 approach of make your own fun. It's a problem that, in fairness, was solved well enough just by throwing some more content at the problem, for as dry as a series of races might be, it's still a better progression system than Gran Turismo 7. The track selection of Forza 2023 makes for an interesting story of progression in and of itself. If you start playing the game today, you'll have 29 different locations to play with a mix of fictional and real-world tracks, some old favourites, and some neat new offbeat picks for each, providing a decent amount of variety for your racing. The thing is, 9.5 of those were added in post-launch updates, and that's enough to make the options at launch feel a little bit anemic. It's not Forza 5 levels, but it felt pretty close, and that didn't help with the underwhelming feeling this game provoked when it first dropped. We'll start with the real-world circuits that returned from previous games: Barcelona, Spa, Homestead Miami, Indianapolis, Le Mans, Lime Rock Park, Mugello, the Nürburgring Grand Prix track, Road America, Silverstone, Suzuka, VIR, and Watkins Glen all made the cut. These tracks are all pretty much the same as we last saw them. If anything, they've had some layout options removed in a few cases. Homestead's weird hybrid layouts are gone, Indianapolis's motorcycle track is gone, the Bugatti circuit is gone, the entire Nordschleife wasn't there at first, and even recent additions like Virginia's Patriot circuits have vanished. The last returning real track is Laguna Seca, which I've singled out because it has the one new layout for a returning track, in the form of the mysterious short circuit. This is actually the old layout of the track, last used in 1987 before the current layout was introduced for safety reasons. I personally had no idea there was that sort of history to this place, and it's a fun example of what I've always said games like this have the opportunity to do. Nobody can race here in real life anymore, so why not? Like with Forza 5, only one fictional track makes the cut to the next generation. This time, it's Maple Valley, now apparently sporting a Mobile One sponsorship, but otherwise in its Forza 7 incarnation. There isn't much more to be said, so let's instead talk about what's new. Forza 23 ends the routine of a prestige new track based on a marketable city, and instead introduces 3 fictional but honest-to-God racing venues. Eagle Rock Speedway is the first representation in the series of the short oval. Just over a mile in length, it makes for some raw, close-quarters racing. The club layout puts a massive chicane on one of the oval straights, a huge braking zone that makes it easy to pick off cars lap by lap if you're brave enough to try it. Grand Oak Raceway constantly feels like it's gonna be a bit generic, but it's got more going on than the layout might suggest. It's all camber and elevation changes on the widest track you could imagine. Picking your braking points on a lap is crucial but very difficult, as you don't have to get it that wrong to understeer into the dirt or careen into someone who's got it right and surfing the groove of the corner. That said, keep some guts in you to take the final corner flat, because in my experience, almost any car can if you get your turn in right. Lastly, Hakone is a downforce lover's dream. It feels a bit like if you stretched Maggots and Beckett's from Silverstone and made a whole circuit out of that somehow. There's not really such a thing as a slow corner around here. Whether the Grand Prix or club layout, it's all about maximising the speed you can carry through the corners and drafting those who couldn't down the straights. The 2 new real tracks are suitably Forza if you ask me, threading that needle of recognisable while also giving Forza quite a unique selling point in being a game of this calibre that has them at all. Kyalami was a big part of the marketing for this game, and aside from DLC for Assetto Corsa Competizione, this is basically the only high-profile racing game it's been in. It might not be the old track I played on an F1 Challenge mod back in the day, but this is still a fun track. A mostly uphill run through the first part of the lap before the sort of plunging downhill run I've shared my love for several times already? Yes please. The last new track is Mid-Ohio, joining the pantheon of weird little American tracks finding a home in this series. While I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity not to have the start line halfway around the track like it is in real life, it's still nice to have it. The first corner is a humbling experience if you're not prepared for quite how fast you can take it, and the fastest section of the course leading into an uphill blind flick to the left is another daredevil moment. And at first, that was all you had. There was definitely a feeling that this game was pretty disappointing in terms of its content on offer if you've been waiting for it for 6 years. The thing is, much as the Xbox One generation of Forza Motorsport games have been hit by the 2010s model of microtransactions and DLC, so too is this one afflicted by the 2020s model of live service. The Builder's Cup was so short and shallow because additional content was always unlocking as time and seasons passed. Race this limited time set of races to earn a special car or a driver suit, check in for your dailies, grind your garage to max level, you know. And the linchpin of all of this was the monthly updates, providing a steady stream of new content in a much more substantial form than a server update. Oh yeah, this game's always online, by the way. It's a bit of a moot point now, because after all of these updates, I think the content is really good, but you also can't ignore the feeling of being drip-fed while it was all going on, which really didn't help the perception that this game was a bit lackluster overall, and well, look where we are now. Nonetheless, of the 22 title updates this game has had at time of writing, 10 of them added new tracks to the game. I say new, but all of them are actually tracks that appeared in previous games. The first 4 updates added Yas Marina, the Hockenheim Ring, Daytona, and expanded the Nürburgring location to finally include the Nordschleife. Update 7 added Brands Hatch, Update 9 added Sebring, and Update 11 finally added Road Atlanta, in a bit of a snub for a track that had been part of the series since the very beginning. Update 15 added Mount Panorama to complete the lineup of real-world circuits, but before that, Update 13 added something of a curveball. Having skipped the previous generation entirely, Sunset Peninsula came back. This was effectively the game's first anniversary update, so digging into the archives for a track to bring in makes some sense, but this seems a curious one to bring back after so long, considering the ethos of the series and how many real-life ovals it now boasted. The final track was added in Update 20 in May 2025. The series' 20th anniversary was marked in Update 20 by finally fulfilling a request going back a majority of those 20 years and bringing back Fujimi Kaido. Now, unlike every other game it's appeared in, Forza 2023 doesn't have a point-to-point race mode, so your only option is to race the full circuit in either direction, but what's a bit of removed options between consumers and megacorps? And with that full circle moment, we rather serendipitously end up at quite a fitting ending. The Forza franchise isn't going anywhere. At time of writing, Horizon 6 has just been announced, and it too is doing what fans have wanted for years by going to Japan. But by all accounts, Forza Motorsport is probably gone for the foreseeable future. It was a slow demise done quickly. The series has felt like it's been on life support forever, and yet the latest game in the series isn't even 2 years old yet. I'm not here to try and tell anyone how it could have survived. Clearly I'd have been happy if they just kept putting tracks in, but there's obviously more than that for most people. But I can try and explain why it maybe didn't. Tracks are at the heart of racing games just as much as cars, and for people like me, even more so. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum of racing games to what we've been looking at this whole time, just look at Mario Kart World. Lots of people are really starting to sour on that game because they don't like the relative lack of interest in not racing around a tightly designed and themed environment. And I think the same principle holds true for a public-friendly simcade racer just as much as a chaotic kart racer. I love real-life racing, and I love the opportunity that games like this give me to drive around racetracks that exist in real life and that chances are I will never actually get to drive on myself. But if all you have is real-life racetracks, you erode some of the character that you can get from a fictional design. Forza has always tried to chase realism, on a relative scale of course. This is still a racing game you can very easily play with a controller, but seemingly at a cost of originality. It sometimes feels like, if they could, they'd love to get rid of all the fictional tracks, and make these games an exercise in how closely they can replicate a slice of the real world inside a computer. They only really figured out that there is an affection for the original tracks towards the end. And even then, in the 8 years between Forza 6 and Forza 2023, they only really had Maple Valley to show for it, before drip-feeding recreations of other Forza 1 originals over a year later. This all leads into what I feel sums up this whole business pretty well, and that's the 20th anniversary celebration baked into Update 20 for Forza Motorsport. The Spirit of Forza Motorsport tour in career mode lets you drive the various cover cars on a selection of tracks that are supposed to evoke the spirit of each game in the series. And sure, spirit is a nebulous term, but there's a lot of spirit you can't represent without the original locations that define what it is to play these games. If they'd been able to keep the Montserrat locations in the Xbox 360 games, or Sedona, or even the city tracks in the Xbox One games, they wouldn't be stuck in the position of having to represent 20 years of the series with a few real-world circuits that could have appeared in any racing game. There's more spirit than you'd know from what's on offer here, basically. I played these games in order for this video, and I wrote about each one after I played all the tracks contained within. I saw a bit of everything: career modes, time trials, arcade modes, lots and lots of free play in varying states of quality of life. I saw this series grow, from copying Gran Turismo's homework, to forging its own identity and being top dog, to carrying the burden of a dying console, to an attempted rebirth stymied by a publisher in freefall. I rediscovered old favourites, saw these games in a different way on occasion, and at times might have been the only person in the world playing it that day. I didn't know when I started this project that the final game in the series had attempted to pay tribute to its own history on the way out, and with the skeleton crew now left supporting it and the last major update making previously live service content accessible indefinitely, this in-game tribute will presumably be here for as long as the game remains playable. For reasons not entirely of its own making, Forza Motorsport's tribute to itself doesn't get to tell the full story. I would never claim I've managed to either, but if this is indeed the end, I'm at least satisfied I've been able to tell my story with it. And hey, at the very least, my story doesn't have to end. Did you see how little progress I've actually made in any of these games, despite everything? Thanks for the memories, Forza Motorsport, but this won't be the last you see of me.